The separatists are the community that eventually becomes the Pilgrims. It's also out of a separatist form of Puritanism that the Baptists, the origins of the Baptist Church, will come as well. The non-separatists are the larger community. We'll have a larger group come to Massachusetts Bay, one that's actually more successful. As they come to Massachusetts Bay, they see themselves as, well, they use the phrase sitting on a hill from the Sermon on the Mount, that they are going to be an example to England of how a community should be run. So, again, they're heavily influenced by Geneva and Calvin's union of church and state and this Reformed Protestant model. And so they believe that if they go set up a colony, run that colony according to the laws of the Bible, where there's this union between the Congregationalist Church and the government, that will lead to England taking a look and saying, oh, well, they were right, so we need to change. So I believe a lot of the non-separatist Puritans believed that eventually they would kind of reunite with England, which doesn't really happen. There's still a lot of conflict. There are a couple challenges to Puritanism that takes place in New England that are important to pay attention to. One is the efforts of a man named Roger Williams. Williams, before we get to the restoration of mindset, Williams felt that the Puritan church was too coercive, that people were forced to attend worship services, they were forced to adopt certain standards of morality as a matter of law. In some cases, of course, Williams didn't necessarily disagree in the sense of what was moral and what was immoral, but the idea of coercing belief was problematic for Williams. There were other challenges to Puritanism. A woman named Anne Hutchinson kind of causes a problem where she begins teaching to mixed audiences, mixed groups in her home. So it's here's a woman taking kind of the authority of a preacher. So she faces both religious problems and a religious trial and a secular trial as well.
She was born at the state.
No, she was not. She was kicked out of Rhode Island, or kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, as was Roger Williams, and goes to Rhode Island. And Hutchinson actually dies from an Indian attack, a Native American attack. So there are these questions within Puritanism over the relationship between church and state. Of course, there are other things, like there's the witchcraft trials, Salem and other things like that. But one of the things that's important as far as our purposes has to do with how Puritans thought of themselves in a type of restorationist mindset. That they saw themselves as enacting the events of the Bible. That they were, that the events of the Bible were a type and they were the anti-type. They were a fulfillment of these things. So they saw themselves as a new Israel going off into the wilderness of New England. They saw themselves as the Israelites escaping from the Pharaoh of the king. And so they really saw themselves as kind of conflated with the times of the first century church. And so this restorationist mindset of trying to follow the laws of the Bible. Now, it's not exactly the same type of restorationism as we'll see with Campbell and Stone and what becomes the Restoration movement in America. But even within Puritanism, there is this mindset of trying to restore the church. So Puritanism is an important strand, both in Europe as well as in the United States. Another important strand in this is the development of evangelicalism during what's known as the Great Awakening. So evangelical had been a term that had been used by people like Martin Luther, particularly to emphasize the difference between justification by faith and justification by works. But in the 18th century, in Great Britain and the United States, it begins to take on a different type of meaning as it is connected with revivalism. So, shaped by a German movement known as Pietism, these individuals, these evangelicals, were emphasizing a experience of religion that was based on both a deep Bible study, emphasis on the importance of Scripture, but then also the emphasis on the inward spiritual life. Right? So it wasn't just like Anglicanism, which emphasized conforming to doctrine, whether you were in conformance with the teaching or not. These people started to emphasize the importance of the inward spiritual life, having an active day-to-day Christianity. And so you have this importance of an emphasis on Christian faith, correct living, a desire to have fellowship with other Christians of similar mindset, as opposed to necessarily having godly order in society imposed from the government. And particularly was this impassioned appeal to people through preaching. Preaching prior to this point, in a lot of Protestantism, there wasn't much of a concern on trying to stir the emotions of people. Right? It was convicting people intellectually. But evangelicalism becomes about this desire to revive a emotional connection to God and not just a sense to certain intellectual propositions. This is evangelicalism and revival, particularly this revival evangelicalism. And so there was a focus on the importance of conversion, the need to be converted, that your life after conversion should look different than what it was before, and that there should be this identifiable experience of conversion. You should be able to point to the moment where you were converted. And that was to be part of your entering the church, part of becoming a church member. So for a lot of these groups, Presbyterians, Puritanism, you might be baptized as an infant, but the evangelical forms of these churches expected that at some point in your teens, maybe early adulthood, you would have some type of conversion experience that would make you a full member of the church, where you could take communion, where you could participate in decisions of the churches, and in some places like New England, you could actually vote. You could only vote if you were a member of the church. And so evangelicalism becomes much more of this focus on conversion, particularly this emotional conversion experience. And again, as I said, this is finding its expression in different types of denominations. It's not really one particular denomination, but you have it occurring in Presbyterianism, in the Baptist Church, what's becoming the Methodist Church, even though it's not a completely separate denomination from the Church of England at the time. And so you have a variety of important preachers who are going around at this time. I can't remember if I put their names on the slide or not. But people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, who are emphasizing the importance of this emotional recognition of your state before God. So Edwards one of Edwards' most famous sermons, not his only sermon, but one of his famous sermons is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which talks about how sinful humanity is looked upon by God. And so it's in that context where where Edwards talks about God despises us like one would despise a spider. It's only by His hand it's only His hand that keeps the ground from swallowing you up. Just how detestable human beings are in their natural state. And so this is causing a lot of people to have these emotional experiences and experience conversion. A large number of people claiming conversion, increase in attendance. And then there's also the preaching of George Whitefield, who's connected with John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. He too is preaching on the importance of conversion, particularly the new birth, is the phrase that he uses a lot, and will travel throughout the colonies, preaching, getting these large audiences of people coming to hear him. It's estimated that at least a quarter of the people in the British North American colonies heard Whitefield speak, which, it's not like a sizable group we might think of in numbers, but for how spread out people were at the time, this is the 1730s to the 1750s is what we're talking about. Sizable numbers are coming to hear him. So, essentially, what you have coming out of this is this emphasis on the importance of motion, but also the importance of Bible study, the importance of sharing the message. Part of being born again is now evangelizing, right? And so, you have a lot of people going around sharing the message of Christianity, or at least their version of Christianity. But there's also the beginning of a break between these upper class ministers and lower class common Christians. And so a lot of the traditional clergy, particularly in New England, are opposed to evangelicalism because there's this idea that, anybody can preach if God's called them to preach, and they don't necessarily need education. Where a lot of these other ministers have gone to Harvard, they've gone to Yale, they've gone to, some of these other early colleges and been trained, spent years undergoing training, and then all of a sudden you have these people claiming to be ministers who, the previous day they were farmers, and so they have this call to preach and they're out there preaching. And so there's a lot of conflict between the clergy, which felt ministry should be about reason, it should be rational, it should be temperate. Right? God is not a God of disorder, which is what they feel a lot of the revivalism is, with its emotional expressions. And then sometimes in the South, for example, you had a lot of conflict because some of the colonies in the South, the official church was the Church of England, and so to be allowed to preach, you had to be licensed to preach. And a lot of these evangelical preachers were not licensed, and so here are these upper-class Anglicans, these lower-class evangelicals. One of the unfortunate aspects of this is that evangelicalism in the 18th century, especially in the South, tended to be on the egalitarian side. So they were preaching against slavery in the 18th century, which is another reason they got in trouble with the upper class. But that egalitarianism is tempered, so that by the 1800s, the 19th century, it's evangelicals who are preaching that it's okay to own slaves and slaves need to obey their masters, and they kind of back off that egalitarian message, and probably as an attempt to try and gain a hearing, not have to worry about as much persecution or those kind of things. But while this period in the middle of the 18th century saw a lot of increase in religion and attendance, it doesn't really, there's another side to all of this as well. Now, certainly the colonial period was a time period of a lot of religion, a lot of people that tried to live their lives out as godly Christians, but church membership in this period, especially as you get closer to the Revolution, declined. There were particularly, church membership, as we talked about, in many cases, people were baptized but wouldn't become a church member until they had this conversion experience later on in life. And in some cases, people, as they got into the late teens, they got into the young adulthood, weren't having these conversion experiences. And so they weren't becoming members of these churches because you would have to present your conversion experience, and then the church or the minister would decide whether or not you could join the church, whether they were going to accept your testimony. And so there's this decline of people throughout the 18th century of having these conversion experiences. And so there's a lot of people attending churches, but there's not a lot of people that are members of churches. And there's also a lot of moral decline as well. For example, between 1761 and 1800, a third of all first births in New England occurred after less than 9 months of marriage. Right? So figure that out with a little bit of math.
Occurred after
less than 9 months after marriage.
Oh, wow.
So the birth of their first child occurred before 9 months had passed after they've been married, right? So obviously some of these marriages are occurring because people are pregnant. Now, in some cases, of course, some of those might have been premature births, but there were harsh laws against fornication on the books in some of these colonies, yet people were engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. Other scholars have said single women in New England during the colonial period were more likely to be sexually active than belong to a church. So, you have a lot of people attending, predominantly because in many of the colonies it's required. But their lifestyle is not always living up to it. So you have this decline in church membership. You have people claiming to be following Christianity but aren't living up to it. And so there are these small minorities that are part of these established churches.